I had ridden past the smoke for a good half hour, telling myself it was none of mine, before the wind turned and brought me the smell of a man's whole life burning, and I knew I was lying. A homestead does not smell like a brush fire. It smells like tar paper and seed corn and the oil off a saddle, like the year somebody hauled glass for a window all the way up a wagon road that did not deserve glass. I sat my horse on the lip of Spear Gap with the reins loose in my hand and watched a thread of black climb off the benchland below me, and I counted, the way a man counts who has spent too many years learning to count such things. 3 fires. Then, off to the south, where the Camas Road came up out of the low country, a 4th. I was 41 years old that summer, and I had not owned a roof in 11 of them. I want that understood from the start, so you'll know what it cost me to do what I did. A man who has put down everything he ever loved into hard ground learns to keep his hands empty. Empty hands don't break. I had a horse, a rifle, a bedroll, and a name I'd half stopped answering to, and that was the whole of my estate, and I had arranged it that way on purpose. So when the rider came up the grade toward me, a boy, really, hatless, lathered, his horse blowing like a bellows, every sense I owned told me to put my heels to my gelding and ride north over the saddle and be 3 valleys gone by dark. "You headed up," the boy gasped, hauling alongside. He couldn't have been more than 15, and there was soot in the creases of his neck and a burn shining red along one forearm that he hadn't yet had time to feel. "Mister, are you headed up the pass?" "I'm headed through it," I said. "There's only the one place up there worth going to." He twisted in his saddle and looked back down the road we'd both climbed, and his face did a thing I'd seen on grown men, which was to try to be brave and fail and try again. "Stillwater Station. Mrs. Teagues, you tell her." He stopped. He started over. "You tell her Mallow burned the Sayers out and the Halseys, and he's coming up the road behind me with the whole outfit, 40 near as I could count. Tell her don't wait for the marshal." "There ain't a marshal coming." "Tell her yourself," I said. "I'm not going to her station. I'm going over the top of this country and down the other side." The boy looked at me. I have remembered that look for the rest of my life. He wasn't angry. He didn't curse me, the way I half wanted him to, so I could ride off feeling I'd given as good as I got. He just looked at me the way you'd look at a stranger who'd told you he didn't believe in weather, and then he put his heels to his horse and went on up the grade without me, a burned boy carrying a warning to a woman I'd never met, because nobody else would. I rode north a 1/4 mile, then I stopped. I have tried, across the long years since, to tell myself it was reason that turned me around, that I worked it out that 40 men who would burn out families would not stop at one pass, that there is no riding far enough from a thing like that, that a man has to make his stand somewhere. There's truth in all of it, but the plain fact, the one I made my peace with later in a church I am not ashamed to have wept in, is simpler and worse. I had let men down before. I had stood at the lip of something and chosen my empty hands over a stranger's need, and lived to carry it, and I could not do it twice. The boy's look had reached into me and found the part I thought I'd buried in the cold ground with everything else, and that part stood up. I turned my horse around and went up the pass. Stillwater Station sat where the road bent hard around a granite shoulder, in the only fold of that whole dry country where water came up out of the rock and stayed. You smelled it before you saw it, green, in a land that had no business being green. Cottonwoods, 3 of them, big as a church is tall. A stone trough, and below it a stone tank, and below that a stone house that was not a house so much as a small fort some careful man had spent his life building. Walls 1.5 feet thick, quarried out of the shoulder it leaned against. A loft, a heavy plank gate set in a wall that ringed a yard, a stable, a forge. There was nothing soft about it. It had been built by somebody who understood that the only thing standing between this water and the men who would want it was good stone and the will to stay behind it. The yard was full of people who did not belong to the place. I saw that as I rode in. A wagon, half unloaded. A clutch of women and old men and children pulled in close to the well like livestock that smells a storm. And a boy, my boy, The burned one sliding off his horse into the arms of a woman who held him hard for 1 second and then set him back to look at his arm. She was the one who turned and saw me first. Marin Teague was not a small woman and she was not a young one, and I say both as the highest compliment I know how to pay. She had 30-odd years on her, and the sun had spent every one of them, and she stood in the gate of her station with a Spencer carbine held across her body, the way a person holds a tool they have used so often it has stopped being a thing and started being a part of them. Her hair was coming down out of its pins on one side. She had a man's coat on over a dress, and her eyes went over me, the gelding, the rifle, the trail dirt, the years, the way you'd read a brand fast and total, looking for the part of me that meant her harm. "You're not one of Mallow's," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd already decided. A man's gun rides different than a hired killer's. She knew the difference the way I knew the difference between a horse that's tired and a horse that's lame. "No, ma'am." "Then you've got bad timing." She stepped back to let me through the gate, and that small motion told me more about her than an hour of talk would have. She was letting an armed stranger into the one place she had to protect. In the same minute she'd learned 40 men were coming to kill her, because she'd looked at me and made a judgment, and she was going to live or die by her own judgment and no one else's. "Wick's burned. Can you doctor?" "Some." "Then doctor. The water's free." And she turned her back on me, turned her back on a stranger with a rifle, and went to settling her people, because a man's arm was burned, and that was the thing in front of her, and Marin Teague always did the thing in front of her. I have been in armies. I have served men who wore their rank like a second skin, and could not have led a dog to a bone. I knew, standing in that yard with the cottonwoods turning their leaves in the hot wind, that I had ridden in under the command of the most natural soldier I would ever meet, and that she did not know the word for what she was and would not have cared. I doctored the boy's arm. Wick, his name was Wick Halsey, 15, the oldest of the children whose mother sat gray-faced by the well, who had been at the Sayer place borrowing a fro when the riders came, and who had ridden ahead of the fires the whole way up to carry the warning. While I worked grease into the burn and wrapped it, I learned the shape of the thing, in pieces, from him and from the others, the way you learn a battle. Nobody has the whole of it, everybody has a corner. It was the water. It is almost always in that country the water. The Cordova Land and Water Syndicate had bought up the lower valley, or bought up the paper that said they owned it, and they wanted Spear Gap because Spear Gap held the spring, and a syndicate that holds the only spring on a road holds the road, and holds every homestead the road feeds, and can name its own price for a man's whole life or take it for nothing. There was a survey coming. There were lawyers somewhere far off. But up here the syndicate did its surveying with a man named Brun Mallow and 40 riders, and Mallow's instrument was fire. Burn the homesteads, the small ones, the scattered ones, and the families would run, and a man who has run does not come back to file a claim. Then the only thing left on the pass would be Stillwater Station, and the only thing left standing in Stillwater's gate would be a widow alone, and a widow alone with the last water in 40 miles is not, in the arithmetic of men like Mallow, a problem. She's a formality. "My husband built this place," Marin told me that evening, when the children were bedded down in the loft and the old men were set at the loopholes and the dark was coming up out of the canyons like water filling a cup. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. "Eli, he freighted in every stone of it. He used to say the spring would outlast all of us, and the man who held the spring held the country, and he meant it as a comfort." She looked out the loophole at the black shape of the gate. "He never thought about what it'd mean when somebody else worked out the same sum." "How long's he been gone?" 4 years. A pause. "Mountain fever. It took him in a week. I sat right here and watched it." She wasn't asking for anything when she said it. She laid it down between us like a stone she'd carried so long it had worn smooth. "I've run the station since. People said I'd sell. The syndicate said I'd sell. I've had 3 men ride up here with papers and a pen and a smile, and I sent all 3 back down the road with their hats in their hands." She turned and looked at me then, full on in the lamplight. I am not going to run, mister. What is your name? Durry Cabe Durry. I'm not going to run, Mr. Durry. I want that clear before the morning, because the morning is going to ask everybody in this house whether they meant the things they said in the dark. I've got 11 people behind these walls and a spring under them and 4 years of my husband's work around them, and there is not enough fire in the world to make me hand it to a man like Brun Mallow. Now you came up this pass on your own legs, and you can ride down it on them tonight, and I will think no less of you. There's a moon, you'd be clear by dawn. She held my eye. Or you can tell me what you can do, and I'll find you a place on the wall. I should tell you what I felt, and I will try, though it has taken me most of a lifetime to find words for it that don't shame me. What I felt when that worn, unbending woman offered me my freedom in the same breath she offered me her wall, was the ground coming back up under my feet. For 11 years I had been a man who held his hands empty so they couldn't be broken. And here was a woman who had been broken already, who had watched her man die in the bed behind us, who had buried half her dreams in the rock she was standing on, and who had decided, alone, to fill her hands anyway and hold them out into the fire. She had no business doing it. She was going to lose. The arithmetic was Mallow's, and everybody in that house knew it. And she was not going to run. I was a scout, I said. Cavalry before. I can read ground and I can read men and I can shoot a long way and not be in a hurry about it. I know how 40 men come at a wall, and I know the 3 things they'll do wrong because 40 men always do them. I set my hat on the table. It is a small motion. It does not look like much. But a man who lays down his hat in a house is telling that house something, and Marin Teague, who read Brands faster than any person I ever knew, read it. Find me a place on the wall, Mrs. Teague. Something moved behind her eyes. Not softness. She had no time for softness, and I would learn she had little patience for it even in good times. It was more like recognition, one tired soldier to another. She nodded once. The loft, she said. You'll have the high ground and the long sight. I'll take the gate. Of course she would take the gate, the most dangerous post in the place, and she took it for herself without a word about it because that was where she'd want to be, and Marin Teague never asked another soul to stand a place she wouldn't stand first. There's coffee. It's the last of it for a while, so drink it like it matters. I drank it like it mattered. We sat at her husband's table in her husband's fort, and we drank the last of the coffee, and outside in the dark the cottonwoods turned their leaves, and far down the pass, where the Camas road came up out of the low country, a fire that did not belong to any homestead burned steady and patient in the night. Mallow's camp. He was not coming in the dark. He was letting us see it. He was letting us lie awake doing his arithmetic for him. He had never met Marin Teague. Neither, until that day, had I, and I will tell you plainly, looking back across all of it from the porch of the house where I am writing this, that the great mistake of Brun Mallow's life, the one that undid him, was the same mistake I'd very nearly made myself at the top of that grade. He looked at a worn woman alone with the last water in the country, and he saw a formality. They came up the road in the gray of the morning, slow, in no hurry, the way men come when they have already done the sum and believe the answer. I lay in the loft with the rifle and watched them ride into the open below the station and spread into a loose half-circle out past good rifle range, and I counted them, and the boys' count had been true. Near 40. They had wagons behind them, and on one of the wagons something long and dark under a tarp, and I did not like the look of the wagon, and I would come to like it less. A man rode out ahead of the rest on a tall blood-bay horse, and stopped where his voice would carry, and that was Brun Mallow. I could tell it was him before he ever spoke. There is a way a certain kind of man sits a horse in front of other men, easy, ornamental, sure of his welcome in the world. He had a good coat and a good hat and a face that had never once in its life been told no by anybody it couldn't replace. "Stillwater," he called, friendly as a neighbor. "Mrs. Teague, I know you're up. Come on out and let's not make this a hard morning for anybody." She didn't answer from the gate. She answered from the wall beside it, where she'd cut a loophole at exactly the height of her own eye, so that her voice came out of the stone and a man below couldn't tell quite where, And that was Eli Teague's careful building and Marin Teague's careful using of it, and it unsettled Mallow's men more than a shout would have. "Say it from there, Mr. Mallow. We can hear you fine." "Now, ma'am," Mallow spread his hands. "There's no call for the loopholes. I'm a businessman. I've got a paper here all legal that says the syndicates bought the water rights on this pass and a fair price for the improvements, which is generous considering. You take the price, you keep your wagon and your stock and your people, and you ride down to Quartz Bend and start fresh with money in your hand. That's the whole of it. That's me being a Christian about it." "You burned the Sayers out at midnight," Marin said. "Old Tobe Sayers 70, and you ran him into the rocks in his nightshirt. You burned the Halseys, and a child of theirs near died of the smoke. That's the part of your Christianity you left off the paper." A little wind went through Mallow's men. Not much, but men who burn families at night for wages mostly prefer not to hear it said out loud in daylight by a woman whose voice is coming out of a stone wall, and Marin knew it, and that was why she said it. She was not arguing with Mallow. She knew there was no arguing with Mallow. She was talking past him to the 40. "That's regrettable," Mallow said, and his voice had cooled. "Fires get away from a man. The thing about it is, Mrs. Teague, you're standing on a piece of ground my employers paid for, and I'm authorized to remove you, and I'd a sight rather pay you to leave than pay my boys to make you. But I'll do whichever costs me less by sundown, so you sleep on the number." He gathered his reins. "I'll come back tomorrow morning and you can sign, or you can hand it to the lawyers when there's nothing left up here worth a lawyer's time. Your husband built a fine house, ma'am. It'd be a shame." He rode back to his half-circle and they made their camp out past our range, easy, sure, settling in. And that, I understood, lying in the loft with the sun coming up hot off the rock, was the shape of how Brun Mallow meant to win. Not a charge, not a battle, a siege. We had the spring, he had everything else. He had the time, the men, the supply wagons, the road home. We had 11 souls behind a wall and a tank of water that would not last 11 people and their stock through a long, dry siege. And the moment it ran low, we'd have to come to him, and he knew it. The spring that was our strength was also the rope he meant to hang us with. He'd just sit on the road and let the arithmetic do the killing. I came down out of the loft and found Marin at the tank with a stick of charcoal, marking the stone at the water line. "He's not going to fight," I said. "No," she didn't look up. "He's going to wait. I figured that the minute I saw the wagons. A man who means to fight doesn't bring 3 weeks of beans." She straightened and pushed the loose hair off her face with the back of her wrist, and for the first time I saw the cost of it sitting on her, the weight of 11 lives and a number ticking down on a stone wall. "I've watered stock off this spring for 9 years, Mr. Durry. I know to the bucket what it gives in a dry August. With the people we've got and the animals, drinking careful, we have got maybe 9 days. He's got 9 weeks. He doesn't have to climb the wall. He just has to be patient, and patience is the one thing rich men have got all the way down to the ground." She marked the stone, day 1. "I want to tell you that I had an answer. I didn't not that morning. What I had was the thing I'd carried up the pass, the cold, sure knowledge of how I'd failed before, and a stubbornness that had grown up over the wound like bark over a cut. I'd watched a column die once in country worse than this, because the men who could have come for them did the arithmetic and decided the cost was too high. I had been one of the men who could have come. I had been overruled, that's true. I'd argued for the ride and been told to stand down. But a man who lives carries the thing he argued for and lost, not the order he was given. I had spent 11 years agreeing, in the deep, silent part of me, with the officers who'd done the arithmetic. The numbers had been against the ride. The numbers were always against the ride. Standing at that tank, watching Marin Teague mark day 1 on a stone, I understood for the first time with my whole body that the numbers being against the ride is not a reason. It is only a number. The reason is the 11 souls on the far side of it. 9 days is more than enough, I said. She looked at me. For what, Mr. Durry? For 40 men to get tired of waiting. I took the charcoal out of her hand. It was the first time I touched her, just her fingers, dry and strong and scarred at the knuckles from work. A rich man's patience is in his men, ma'am, and his men aren't rich. They get hot and they get bored and they get to thinking about the families some of them have heard about now, screaming in stone walls, and they get to wondering what a court'll do to the man who pointed and the men who carried the torch. Mallow's patience is a thing I can spend. We just have to make these 9 days cost him more than he thinks they're worth, not in blood, in time and in nerve and in doubt. A siege runs both ways. He's counting our water. I'm going to teach him to count his own men. It was the first morning. I had no plan yet, only a direction, the way you set off toward a mountain you can't yet see a road up. But I watched something change in her face when I said it, not hope exactly. Marin Teague was too worn for easy hope. It was the look of a person who has been carrying a weight alone for 4 years and has just felt, for the first time, somebody put a shoulder under the other end of it. "All right," she said quietly, "then let's teach him. I will not give you all 9 days. A man my age, telling a thing this long after, has learned that the truth of a siege is not in every hour of it but in the few hours that turned it, and I'll give you those." We made Mallow's days long. That was the whole of my craft and Marin's, and it was a craft of nerve more than gunpowder. By day we showed him a fort that did not care he was there, smoke from the cook fire, the sound of an axe wick mending tack in the yard where Mallow's glass could find him, the deliberate ordinary noise of people who had decided they lived here and meant to go on living here. Nothing tells a besieging army it has failed like the smell of someone else's bread. By night we moved. I knew the ground now. I'd read it from the loft. I knew where a man could come up a dry watercourse to within 100 yards of Mallow's pickets, and I knew it because I'd spent 11 years learning to come up such places, and I had not once in all that time found a use for the skill that did not shame me. I found one now. I did not kill his pickets. I want that set down plain because it matters to the rest of the story, and it mattered to me. I had had a bellyful of killing, and I had come to believe a thing about men like Mallow's riders, which is that most of them are not Mallow. They are poor men who have hired their guns to a rich man because guns were the only thing they had to hire, and a man like that will face death for $40 a month, but he will not face the dark and the unknown and his own conscience for it, not for long. So I went out into the dark and I taught his pickets to be afraid. A picket would doze and wake to find his horse gone, walked off quiet up a coulee, and find a charcoal mark on the rock where he'd been sitting. A picket would hear from somewhere in the black rocks behind him a man clear his rifle's action, that small, unmistakable, heart-stopping sound, and then nothing, no shot, just the long, awful waiting for one. We left their guns where they slept, sometimes unloaded, the cartridges stacked neat beside them, so a man would wake and understand that someone had knelt over him in the night and chosen not to. There is nothing on God's earth that hollows out a hired man's nerve like understanding that he is alive because a stranger decided he could be. And by the third night, Mallow's camp was not sleeping, and a camp that is not sleeping is a camp that is doing arithmetic of its own. The arithmetic of $40 a month against a coulee full of dark. Inside the walls, Marin ran the water like a quartermaster who'd been to war. Every drop measured. The stock down to a swallow a head, the cottonwoods left to fend, the people on rations that would have shamed a softer woman to enforce, and that she enforced without 1 ounce of apology, because 11 lives depended on the line on the stone, and she would not let it lie for anybody's comfort. She was hard about it and she was fair about it, and she took the smallest share herself. And I watched the old men and the frightened women steady themselves on her hardness the way you'd steady yourself on a post in a current. It was on the 4th night that I told her about the column. We were on the loft wall together in the small hours, the two of us, while the station slept. It had become our hour not by arrangement, just by the way two people who can't sleep find each other in the dark of a place under threat. We didn't talk much most nights. We watched Mallow's restless fires and we kept each other company in the keeping of the watch. But that 4th night she said, out of a long quiet, You've done this before, not the station. The other, going out into the dark to men who'd kill you. She wasn't asking. It's in how careful you are not to enjoy it. And I found, to my own surprise, that I wanted to tell her. I, who had not said the column's name aloud in 11 years. So I told her about the patrol cut off in bad country, and the relief that argued all night around a map, and the numbers, God, the numbers, the cost of the ride against the likelihood of finding men still alive, and the older, wiser, careful officers who did the arithmetic and decided the ride could not be justified, and the morning we found out they had decided wrong. I told her I'd argued for the ride. I told her how little that had ever weighed against the other thing, which was that I had lived, and they had not, and that I had spent 11 years agreeing in my heart that the arithmetic had been sound, that it was reasonable not to go, that a careful man does not throw good lives after lost ones. I told her I'd believed that right up until I sat my horse at the top of her pass, and a burned boy looked at me like I'd told him I didn't believe in weather. She was quiet a long time when I finished. Down below, a picket's horse stamped in the dark, unsettled by something that might have been me on another night and was, that night, only the wind. My Eli used to say a thing, she said finally. When the fever was on him and he knew, he said, "Marin, don't you do the sum." I didn't know what he meant. I thought it was the fever talking. She had her hands wrapped around the cold barrel of the Spencer, and her voice was as level as I ever heard it, which is how I knew what it cost her. I know now. He meant there's going to come a day somebody asks you to do a thing that costs more than it's worth, and the sum is going to tell you no. And you have to be the kind of person who doesn't do the sum, who just stays. Because if everybody does the sum, Mr. Durry, then nobody's ever coming for anybody, and we're all of us just numbers waiting our turn to come out wrong. I have heard preachers preach for an hour and not say as much. "Cabe," I said. She turned her head. "My name, you keep saying, Mr. Durry, it's Cabe." In the dark I couldn't see her smile, but I heard it change her breathing just slightly, the way the air changes before warm weather. "Cabe," she said, trying it, "you came back up the pass." "I came back up the pass." "Most don't." She looked back out at Mallow's fires. "I've watched a lot of men ride down this road and not come back up it. I'd half stopped believing in the kind that does." Her shoulder was an inch from mine on the wall. Neither of us moved it. "I'm glad you do the wrong sum, Cabe Durry." We stood the watch like that till gray, not touching, an inch apart. Two people who'd buried their good hands in hard ground and were, both of us, against all our long, careful sense, digging them up again. On the 6th day, Mallow uncovered the wagon, and I learned what was under the tarp, and for the first time since I'd turned my horse around I was afraid we would lose. It was a gun, a small mountain howitzer, the kind the Army surplused after the war, the kind that ends up in the hands of men with money and bad intentions. He had it run up onto the rock shoulder across the canyon from us, out past rifle range, where he could lob shells down into the yard, not to kill us, not at first, to make the yard unlivable. To crack Eli Teague's careful stone, day after day, and drive 11 people into the one room that held, and then to wait with all his patience for the howitzer or the thirst to do what his nerve-shaken riders no longer would. The first shell came in at noon and burst against the forge and threw stone across the yard, and a woman screamed, and a child cried out in the loft, and I saw in Marin's face as she ran to her people, the first true fear I'd seen on her, not for herself. She had no fear for herself. I'd long since understood that about her. The fear was that her stone, her Eli's stone, the thing that was supposed to outlast them all, was going to come apart over the heads of the children she'd taken in. That night I lay in the loft and did the only arithmetic I have ever fully trusted, which is the arithmetic of ground. The howitzer was on the rock shoulder across the canyon. To serve it, Mallow had to keep men there, away from the main camp, on a finger of rock with one trail up. The gun that could break us was also the gun that had split his 40 into 2 camps, and a thing that is split can be taken a piece at a time. if a man knows the dark and has spent 11 shameful years learning to move through it. I told Marin. I told her what I meant to do, which was to go out alone in the black before moonrise, up the dry watercourse and around behind the rock's shoulder, and spike the gun, drive a file into the touch hole and break it off, so the howitzer became a heavy iron log Mallow would have to haul 40 miles to a foundry. I told her I could do it without killing a man if the dark held. I told her I'd done worse, in country worse, for reasons that didn't deserve me. And Marin Teague, who I had come to understand never asked another soul to stand a post she wouldn't stand first, looked at me a long moment in the lamplight, and did not say be careful, and did not say I can't lose you, though I have wondered since whether both were in her. She said, I'm coming up the watercourse to 100 yards and I'm going to hold it with the Spencer, so that if the dark breaks on you, you have a road home and a gun covering it. I'm not going to do the sum on whether that's wise. I'm just going to be there. And she was. I went up over the rock in the black and I found the gun crew dozing, 3 men sure they were safe behind 40, and I did the work I'd come to do, the file, the touch hole, the snap. And I did it without firing a shot, and I was halfway down off the shoulder when a 4th man I hadn't counted woke and came up out of his blanket with a shout and a pistol. And the dark broke on me, just the way I'd told her it might. I have thought about what happened next more than any other moment of my life, because of what it told me about the woman I was about to spend the rest of that life beside. She did not shoot the man. From 100 yards in the dark with her husband's good carbine and a clean line on a target lit by his own muzzle flash, Marin Teague did not shoot to kill. She put 1 round into the rock a foot from his head, so close he felt the granite sting his face, and then a 2nd into the rock at his feet, and a 4th man on a finger of stone in the dark with 2 bullets sparking off the rock around him, and a 5th he could not know would also miss does not stand and trade shots with a ghost. He went down flat and stayed down and let me go. She bought my life with 2 bullets that hit nothing, because she had decided, somewhere in the long arithmetic of her hard years, that she would hold her ground and protect her own and break the men who came for her, but that she would not become Mallow to do it. She would not put a man in the ground she didn't have to. I came down off that watercourse with my heart going like a hammer, and I found her in the dark where she'd said she'd be, and there was no decision in it, none at all. I took her face in both my hands, her dry, strong, scarred face, and I kissed her once hard with all the 11 empty years in it. And she gripped my coat in both fists and kissed me back like a woman who'd done her own sum and arrived at the same wrong, right answer. Then we went home up the dark watercourse to her station, and we did not speak of it, because there was a siege on and she was not a woman to lose the thread of the thing in front of her, and neither, by then, was I, but I held her hand the whole way up the rocks, and the gun across the canyon never fired again. It broke on the 8th day, and it broke the way I had told her at the tank it would. Not in blood, in nerve and in doubt, and in the truth Mallow had spent the week trying to keep his men from hearing. A camp that cannot sleep starts to talk, and a camp that has lost its great gun in the night to a man it cannot find starts to talk in lower voices still, and the thing those low voices said to one another, out past our range, was a thing Mallow could not stop because it was true. That they were 40 hired men burning families and besieging a widow for a syndicate's water. That there'd been a child near die of smoke. That whatever Mallow had told them about law and paper, no paper in the world was going to stand between them, and a rope if the marshal at Quartz Bend, or the one beyond him, ever did come. And a stranger who could spike a gun in the dark and choose not to cut a sleeping throat was a kind of man who maybe knew things, maybe had friends, maybe had already sent word down the pass. I helped that talk along. On the 7th night I left, pinned to a picket's saddle with his own knife, a thing I had wick letter out fair and plain in a boy's careful hand, not a threat. A list. The Sayer place burned midnight the date. The Halsey place the child the date. A note that these things had been seen and written, and that a copy had gone down the pass to where copies go, and that a man who had only hired his gun and never lifted a torch and chose now to ride home would find his name was not on the list, and a man who stayed would find it was. It was a bluff. There was no copy down the pass. There was no marshal coming. But Brun Mallow had built his whole siege on patience, and patience is a thing that lives in other men's nerve. And I had spent the week hollowing his men's nerve out from underneath him a grain at a time, and a bluff lands hardest on men who have already lost their sleep. Mallow rode up alone on the 8th morning, no half-circle behind him, and that told the tale before he opened his mouth. He sat his blood bay below the wall, and he looked older than he had on the first day, and meaner, the way a sure man gets when the world stops agreeing with him. "You've been busy in the dark," he said. "It's a habit," I said from the loft. "My boys have got it in their heads there's a marshal coming." He said it like a man fishing. "I'd imagine they have a lot in their heads this week." I let it sit. Men do when they stop sleeping. They get to remembering they're not the ones getting rich, and they get to wondering whether the man who is will be standing next to them when the bill comes due, or whether he'll be a long way off with the money, letting them hang for the torches he told them to carry. I watched it land. I watched Brun Mallow understand that the thing that had broken was not his gun and was not his patience. It was the floor under him, the loyalty of 40 men who had just been reminded, all week in the dark, that they were poor and he was not, and that poverty and the rope are old companions. "Name a price," he said low, so the camp behind him couldn't hear the great man bargaining with a hole in a stone wall. "For the water, I'll write a fair paper. You let it be known there's no list, no marshal, and my boys ride home with their pay, and this is done." And then Marin Teague spoke, from her loophole at the height of her own eye, in the voice that came out of the stone. "The water's not for sale, Mr. Mallow. It was never for sale, but I'll tell you what I'll trade you." A pause. The whole pass seemed to hold its breath in it. "You take your men and your wagons and your iron log of a gun, and you go down off my pass and out of this country today, and you don't come back, and I'll let your boys ride down past my gate one at a time. And every man who rode up here and never lifted a torch can fill his canteen at my spring on the way out, free, the way the water's always been free at Stillwater. And I'll write each one a paper in my own hand that says he watered here peaceable and did no burning, that he can show any marshal that ever asks. That's the trade. Their name's off your list, in exchange for going home. You can't pay me a price for my husband's water. But I'll give your men the one thing you've got that they want, which is a clean way out, and I'll give it to them free, because that is how you beat a man like you, Mr. Mallow. You give the men he bought a thing he can't. I have never in my life heard a thing so completely take the legs out from under a man." Because she was right, and Mallow knew it in the same instant his men did, and they were close enough to hear it, every word coming out of the stone. She had not offered to fight them. She had not offered to die well. She had reached over Brun Mallow's head, the way she'd done from the first morning, and offered his 40 hired men the one thing $40 a month had never bought them and never would. A way to walk out of this with clean hands and a paper that said so. She'd turned his whole army into men who suddenly had somewhere better to be, and she'd done it without firing the shot that would have made them stay and fight for their lives. They went, not all at once and not all of them. A handful rode out hard with Mallow, the torch carriers, the ones whose names a paper couldn't clean. But the most of them, the poor men, the saddle-sore sleepless men, came down past Stillwater's gate one at a time in the long gold light of that 8th evening, and filled their canteens at the spring, and took the paper Marin wrote out in her own steady hand at her husband's table, and touched their hats to her, and rode down off the pass and out of the country and out of this story. The siege did not end in a charge. It ended in a line of broke men drinking free water and going home, which is, I have come to believe, very near the only honest way a thing like that ever truly ends. Brun Mallow rode down last with his iron log of a gun on its wagon, and he stopped at the gate, and he looked up at the wall for a long moment, and I will give him this. At the end, he understood exactly what had beaten him, and it was not me. "You should have sold," he said to her. "You should have slept," she said back, and there was nothing in it but the truth. He rode down off Spear Gap and we never saw him again. The syndicate's lawyers wrote letters for 2 more years, and the survey came, and the law, slow as law is, came eventually to the same plain conclusion that a tired widow with a Spencer carbine had reached in an afternoon, which is that the water was hers. I think sometimes that is the whole of what the law is for, to arrive, late and grand, at the things that worn people already knew in their bones and held with their bodies in the dark, before anybody official could be troubled to ride up the pass. But I should end it there, I suppose, if this were the kind of story men tell for the fight in it. But I am an old man riding on the porch of a stone house, and it was never the fight I came back up the pass to tell about. I stayed. I want to set that down as plainly as Marin said everything, because it was the largest thing I ever did and the simplest. The morning after Mallow rode out, I saddled my gelding out of habit, out of 11 years of habit, the way a man fills his hands by emptying them, and I led him out into the yard, and Marin stood in the gate of her station with the loose hair coming down on one side and a man's coat over her dress, and she looked at me and the saddled horse, and she did not say one word to stop me. Of course she didn't. She would never in her life ask a man to stand a post he didn't choose. She just looked at me and let me choose, the way she'd let me choose on the first night with the moon up over the saddle. And I stood there in the yard with the lead rope in my hand, and I did, for the last time, the only sum that has ever mattered. 11 empty years against 1 full one. The cost of staying against the cost of riding. The careful, reasonable, sound arithmetic that had told me my whole life to keep my hands empty so they couldn't be broken. Then I did the wrong sum, which is to say the right one. I unsaddled my horse and I turned him out to the spring, and I walked back across the yard to where she stood in the gate, and I said, "I'm no good at glass, but I can mend stone and I can read this country, and I'm a fair hand at a forge once it's rebuilt. If you've got a place on the wall for a man, Mrs. Teague, I'd like to keep it. Permanent." And Marin Teague, who had buried her good hands in hard ground and dug them up again for a stranger's sake, who had beaten 40 men with free water and a steady pen, who never once in all the years I knew her after asked me to stand a post she wouldn't stand first. Marin Teague took both my hands in both of hers, her dry, strong, scarred hands in mine, and she said, "The water's free, Cabe. It always was. But the place on the wall, that one you have to marry into." And she was almost smiling when she said it, the way she'd almost smiled in the dark on the 4th night, and I understood that I had been proposed to by the most natural soldier I would ever meet, and that I was going to spend the rest of my life saying yes to her, and I have, and it was the only order I ever followed gladly to the end. We were married in Quartz Bend that fall by a circuit preacher, with Wick Halsey standing up beside me grown half a foot, and old Tobe Sayer giving the bride away because she had no one else and he'd lived because she wouldn't run, and the church full of the homestead families who'd come back up onto the pass once they heard the water was held and the way was safe. Marin wore the dress and not the coat. I have a memory of her in the church door with the fall light behind her, turning to find me in the crowd, and it has outlasted nearly every other thing I own. We rebuilt the forge. We mended Eli's stone where Mallow's shell had cracked it, and I will tell you I worked that one wall slower than any other, because it was the work of putting right what a careless rich man had broken in the home of a careful poor one who was dead, and that is holy work, and a man does it slow. The cottonwoods came back green. The water never failed. We took in the travelers and watered their stock free, the way the water had always been free at Stillwater, and we raised between us, in the years that came, children of our own to add to the children Marin had been ready to die for when they were strangers' children sheltering by her well. And I will not put them in this telling, for they are their own stories and not mine to spend, except to say that they grew up knowing how to read ground and how to read men, and that not one of them, to my knowledge, has ever done the wrong sum and stayed home when somebody needed coming for. We taught them better. Their mother taught them. She taught me. She is gone now. For years this past spring, the same fever in the inn, the same week of it, in the same bed her Eli went in, and I sat right there and watched it the way she'd watched him, and I did not run, and I did not do the sum, and I held her good hand in both of mine until it was cold. We are all of us only numbers, she told me once on a dark wall, waiting our turn to come out wrong unless somebody decides to stay. She stayed for me. I stayed for her. It is the whole of what I have to leave, and I find, writing it down on the porch of the stone house she would not sell, that it is enough, and more than a man with empty hands had any right to. I was 41 years old the summer I turned my horse around at the top of Spear Gap, and I had not owned a roof in 11 years, and I had arranged it that way on purpose. I own this one. I will be buried under the cottonwoods within sight of it, beside her, beside Eli, in the green ground over the spring that outlasted us all, just the way he always said it would. He meant it as a comfort. It is one.